The gravel crunched satisfyingly beneath the tires of the station wagon as Elara turned off the main road and onto the winding driveway of Blackwood Cottage. It was not a menacing name, despite the sound of it. The wood bordering the property was simply dark, with the density of ancient oaks and towering pines that had stood guard over this valley for centuries. The engine cut out, and silence rushed in to fill the void, a physical weight that felt like a heavy, comforting blanket. For a moment, she just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the wind sighing through the canopy above. It was late afternoon in early October, the golden hour where the light turns liquid and thick, painting everything in shades of amber and copper. She had left the city 3 hours ago, but it felt like a lifetime. The noise, the constant hum of digital notifications, the pressure of deadlines. It all seemed to recede, trapped behind an invisible barrier at the county line. Elara stepped out of the car. The air here was different. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying leaves. It was cool, crisp enough to require a knitted sweater, but not cold enough to bite. She walked to the trunk and retrieved her single suitcase and a box of groceries, the gravel shifting under her boots. The cottage stood before her, a structure of gray stone and timber, embraced by ivy that had turned a brilliant crimson in the autumn chill. It was not a large house, but it was sturdy, built to weather the seasons, with a slate roof that shimmered with a dusting of moss. The key, a heavy iron thing she had picked out from the solicitor in the village, turned in the lock with a stiff, heavy clunk. The door swung open, revealing a hallway bathed in the soft, suspended light of dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that pierced through the transom window. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and old paper. It was a stillness that felt respectful, as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for her to arrive. She set her bags down on the hardwood floor, the sound echoing gently. There was no Wi-Fi here, no cell service unless she walked up the hill behind the garden. That was the point. She was here to house sit for 3 months, to catalog a private library for an estate that was in probate, but mostly, she was here to remember how to breathe. The first evening was spent in a slow, deliberate ritual of claiming the space. She unpacked her clothes into the cedar dresser in the upstairs bedroom, where the window looked out over the rolling hills of the valley. She arranged her books on the nightstand. She went to the kitchen, a room with soft yellow tiles and a deep porcelain sink, and filled the copper kettle. The sound of the water heating, the low whistle building to a crescendo, was the only urgency in the world. She made a pot of chamomile tea, watching the steam rise and curl in the fading light. She took the mug and wandered through the rooms, trailing her fingers over the furniture. The living room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, cold now, but promising warmth. There were armchairs upholstered in velvet worn smooth by time, and a grand piano in the corner, its lid closed, buried under stacks of sheet music. Night fell not with the sudden switch of city lights, but with a slow, pervasive deepening of the shadows. The blue of the twilight gave way to a velvet black. Elara lit a fire, the dry logs catching quickly, snapping and popping as the flames licked upward. She sat on the rug, the heat warming her face, and simply watched the fire. It was mesmerizing, a primitive television that required nothing of her. She drank her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Outside, an owl hooted, a mournful, hollow sound that emphasized the solitude. She felt a knot in her shoulders. What she hadn't realized she was carrying began to loosen. The next morning, Elara woke with the sun. Without curtains, the light poured into the room, pale and clean. She stretched, feeling the flannel sheets against her skin. There was no alarm clock, no rush to catch a train. She rose and padded down to the kitchen, the floorboards cool under her bare feet. She ground coffee beans, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, a stark, grounding scent against the morning air. While the coffee brewed, she opened the back door. The garden was a wild, overgrown masterpiece. It had once been manicured clearly, but years of neglect had allowed nature to reclaim the lines. Rose bushes had grown into tangled thickets, their thorns guarding late-blooming flowers. Ferns spilled over the stone pathways. In the center of the garden stood a structure that caught her breath. It was a conservatory, a glass house with an iron frame, oxidized to a pale green. It looked like a jewel box dropped into the jungle. It was completely overgrown, vines creeping up the glass, obscuring the interior, but it called to her. After a breakfast of toast and honey, eaten on the back step while watching a robin hunt for worms in the dew-soaked grass, Elara put on her boots and a pair of thick gardening gloves she found in the mudroom. She wasn't here to garden, technically, but the conservatory intrigued her. She waded through the tall grass, the hem of her jeans getting wet. Up close, the structure was even more beautiful. The glass was old, wavy, and imperfect, distorting the view of what lay inside. The door was jammed, rusted shut. She spent the morning clearing the ivy from the doorframe. It was repetitive, meditative work. Pull, cut, unravel. The physical exertion felt good, grounding her in her body. She could feel the muscles in her arms work, the stretch in her back. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and she shed her sweater, working in her t-shirt. The smell of crushed green stems and damp earth was intoxicating. Finally, after hours of work, the door groaned. With a firm shove, it scraped open, revealing the interior. The air inside was warm and humid, trapped by the glass. It smelled of soil and something sweet, like jasmine. It was a jungle in there. Plants had burst their pots, rooting into the dirt floor. Ferns hung from the rafters like green lace. In the center was a stone fountain, dry now, filled with leaves. Elara stood in the doorway, wiping sweat from her forehead, entranced. It was a secret world, a time capsule of botanical life. She decided then and there that this would be her project. The library could wait for rainy days. The conservatory needed her. Over the next few weeks, a routine emerged. Elara would wake, drink her coffee, and head to the conservatory. She worked slowly. There was no deadline. She wasn't trying to impose strict order, just to give the plants room to breathe. She cleared the dead leaves, pruned back the aggressive vines that were choking the delicate orchids, and swept the mosaic tile floor until the intricate patterns of bees and flowers emerged from beneath the dirt. One afternoon, while repotting a large fern, she felt eyes on her. She turned slowly to see a large ginger cat sitting on the potting bench, watching her with golden, unblinking eyes. He didn't run when she moved. He just blinked slowly. "Hello there," she said softly. The cat chirruped, a trilling sound, and hopped down, rubbing his cheek against her shin. He became her constant companion. She named him Barnaby. He belonged to no one and everyone, a spirit of the valley. He would sleep on the warm stones in the sun while he worked, occasionally batting at a falling leaf. The work in the conservatory revealed treasures. She found a collection of succulents on a high shelf, dusty but alive, their fleshy leaves retaining water for years. She found a watering can made of zinc, which she used to carry water from the garden tap. The sound of the water falling on the thirsty soil, the darkening of the earth, was deeply satisfying. The plants seemed to perk up almost instantly, their leaves turning a deeper, glossier green. One rainy Tuesday, when the clouds hung low and gray over the valley, Elara retreated to the library. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books, their leather spines creating a tapestry of browns, reds, and blacks. She lit the fire in the library hearth and began the cataloging. It was a different kind of quiet. The rain lashed against the window panes, blurring the world outside, creating a cocoon of safety. She handled the books with reverence, noting down titles and authors in a leather-bound notebook. She found first editions of botanical encyclopedias, novels from the turn of the century, and books on astronomy. Tucked between two heavy volumes on history, she found a small, handwritten journal. The cover was faded blue cloth. She opened it gently. It was a garden diary, dated from 50 years ago. The handwriting was looped and elegant. The author, a woman named Iris, chronicled the building of the conservatory. She wrote about the light, the soil mixtures, the specific needs of the ferns. Elara sat in a wingback chair. Barnaby curled on her lap and read the journal cover to cover. It felt like a conversation across time. Iris wrote about the solitude of the cottage, how the silence healed her after a great loss. She wrote about the moonlight garden, a section of the conservatory dedicated to plants that bloomed at night or reflected the moon. Inspired, Elara went back to the conservatory the next day with new eyes. She found the section Iris had mentioned. It was in the back corner, where the glass was shaded by a large oak tree outside. There, struggling in a pot that was too small, was a plant with long, flat stems. She recognized it from the drawings in the journal, an Epiphyllum oxypetalum, the queen of the night. It was a cactus that bloomed rarely, and only at night, its flower wilting before dawn. Elara devoted herself to the queen. She carefully repotted it, mixing the soil with sand and leaf mold as Iris had instructed. She placed it in a spot where it would get dappled sunlight. She spoke to it, feeling foolish but doing it anyway. "You're going to bloom," she whispered. Weeks passed. The air grew colder, the frost starting to rim the grass in the mornings, but the conservatory remained a warm haven. The heating system, an old network of pipes, miraculously still worked after she bled the radiators and fired up the boiler in the cellar. The conservatory became her sanctuary. She brought a wicker chair inside and would sit there in the afternoons, reading, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and greenery. One afternoon, she noticed a small, fuzzy bud forming on the edge of one of the queen's leaves. It was the size of a marble. Elara's heart skipped a beat. She checked the journal. Iris described the bud growing rapidly, curving upward like a hook before opening. Elara watched it obsessively. Every day it grew larger, the stem curving, the buds swelling, until it was the size of her fist, white petals peeking through the sepals. According to the journal, the bloom would happen on a night of the full moon. It seemed too poetic to be true, but as the moon waxed, growing rounder and brighter in the crisp autumn sky, the buds seemed to pulse with anticipation. The night of the full moon arrived. The sky was clear, a deep, endless indigo scattered with stars that looked sharp enough to cut glass. The moon rose, huge and pearl white, casting silver shadows across the garden. Elara put on her coat and walked to the conservatory. She didn't turn on the electric lights. The moonlight filtering through the clean glass was enough. It turned the interior into a silver dreamscape. The ferns were cast in silhouette. The air was still. She sat in the wicker chair, wrapped in a blanket, a thermos of tea beside her. Barnaby sat on the table, his tail twitching. They waited. It was a slow magic. At around 10 o'clock, the tip of the bud began to loosen. It wasn't a sudden pop, but a gentle unfurling. Petal by petal, the flower opened. It was pure white, radiating a ghostly luminosity in the moonlight. As it opened, a scent filled the air, sweet-head and vanilla-like, but with a green, wild undertone. It was the most incredible thing Elara had ever smelled. By midnight, the flower was fully open. It was massive, the size of a dinner plate, a starburst of white petals surrounding a center of delicate gold stamens. It looked otherworldly, a creature from the deep sea floating in the air. Elara sat in silence, bearing witness to this fleeting perfection. The flower had waited a year, maybe more. For this what night? It poured all its energy, all its beauty, into these few hours of darkness, uncaring that no one might see it. But Elara saw it. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The anxiety of her old life, the need to be productive, to be seen, to be constantly achieving, dissolved in the presence of the flower. This was enough. Being here, breathing this air, watching this bloom, was enough. She realized that she was no longer the same person who had driven up the gravel driveway weeks ago. She had slowed down. She had learned to listen to the rhythm of the rain, the growth of the plants, the silence of the stone. She stayed until the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon. The flower was already starting to droop. Its job done. It would be gone by sunrise. Elara touched a petal gently, its texture like cool silk. She whispered a thank you. She walked back to the cottage as the birds began their morning chorus. She fell into bed and slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The remaining month of the cottage passed in a golden haze. The library was finished, the books orderly and safe. The conservatory was thriving. Elara began to prepare for her departure, but it was with a heavy heart. On her last day, she did a final round of the grounds. The air was biting cold now, hinting at snow. The trees were bare, the skeletal branches striking against the gray sky. She went to the conservatory a last time. She watered the queen of the night, which was now resting, gathering strength for the next cycle. She left a note on the potting bench for the owners, detailing the care of the plants and placed Iris's journal next to it. It belonged here. As she locked the cottage door and walked to her car, she didn't feel a sense of loss, but rather a sense of fullness. She carried the silence of the valley within her now. She knew she could return to the noise of the city, but she wouldn't let it drown her. She had the memory of the moonlit bloom, the smell of the damp earth, and the quiet companionship of a ginger cat. She started the engine. As she drove down the winding driveway, she looked in the rearview mirror. Barnaby was sitting on the stone wall, watching her go. She smiled. The car turned onto the main road, merging back into the flow of the world. But Elara drove a little slower, breathed a little deeper, carrying the peace of Blackwood Cottage with her, a quiet anchor in a turning world. The journey back was different. She noticed the way the light hit the frost on the fields, turning them into sheets of diamonds. She noticed the hawk circling high above the highway, riding the thermals. She stopped at a small diner halfway home, not checking her phone while she waited for her sandwich, but instead watching the waitress pour coffee, the steam rising in the warm, yellow light of the room. She was present. When she finally arrived at her apartment in the city, the noise of the street below seemed distant, less intrusive. She unlocked her door and stepped inside. It was stuffy, smelling of stagnant air. She immediately walked to the window and threw it open, letting the sounds of the city in. But they were just sounds now, not demands. She unpacked her bag. She took out a small cutting she had taken from a jade plant in the conservatory. She potted it in a small ceramic bowl she had found at a thrift store in the village. She placed it on her windowsill, a small piece of green against the concrete skyline. That night she made chamomile tea. She didn't turn on the TV. She sat by the window, watching the city lights blink like a galaxy of artificial stars. She thought of the conservatory, silent and dark in the valley, the plants breathing slowly in the cool air. She thought of the queen of the night, dormant but alive. She took a sip of tea. She was okay. She was rested. She was ready to begin again, but this time, at her own pace, with the rhythm of the garden beating gently in her heart. The days turned into weeks, and Elara found that the city had not changed, but she had. When the subway was delayed, she didn't check her watch or sigh in frustration. She closed her eyes and visualized the moss on the roof of the cottage, the texture of it, the vibrant green. When a meeting ran long, she focused on the breathing techniques she had practiced in the garden. She found a park near her office, a small patch of green with a few bench seats and a ginkgo tree. It became her micro-sanctuary. She would go there at lunch, ignoring the sirens and the traffic, and watch the squirrels chase each other, or the way the wind moved the fan-shaped leaves. She started visiting the city botanical gardens on weekends. It wasn't the same as the private, secret world of the conservatory, but it was close. She walked through the tropical hothouse, closing her eyes to inhale the humidity, letting it transport her back to the moment she first pried open the rusted door. She learned the names of the plants she saw: Monstera, Calathea, bird of paradise. She felt a kinship with them, fellow living things trying to thrive in an environment of concrete and steel. One evening, deep in winter, snow began to fall on the city. It softened the sharp edges of the buildings, and muffled the roar of the traffic. Elara sat in her apartment, the jade plant on the sill now showing a tiny new leaf. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from the estate lawyer she had worked with. "Dear Elara," it read, "the heirs of the Blackwood estate have reviewed your work on the library and the property. They were particularly moved by the state of the conservatory. They are looking for someone to manage the property part-time, to oversee the maintenance of the house and the gardens throughout the year. It would require a few visits a month, perhaps more in the summer. They asked if you might be interested." Elara looked out at the falling snow. She thought of the long drive, the silence, the smell of wood smoke. She thought of Barnaby the cat, likely curled up in a barn somewhere, waiting for the sun. She looked at her small jade plant. She didn't need to think about it. She typed her reply, her fingers moving lightly over the keys. "I would be delighted." The acceptance felt like a key turning in a lock, the same heavy, satisfying clunk of the cottage door. She wasn't leaving her life in the city, not entirely, but she was building a bridge back to the quiet, back to the earth. She went to the kitchen and began to make a list of seeds to order for the spring. Sweet peas, sunflowers, and maybe, just maybe, another queen of the night, so the one in the valley wouldn't be alone. The snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blanket of white, bringing a rare, hushed peace to the streets. Elara turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow of a lamp. She picked up a book, settled into her chair, and began to read. The contentment inside her deep and abiding, a garden that would never stop growing. The winter months passed with a new rhythm. Elara split her time. During the week, she was the efficient professional, navigating the complexities of her job with a newfound clarity. Her colleagues noticed the change. She was less reactive, more grounded. When crises emerged, as they always did in the corporate world, she remained the eye of the storm, calm and steady. She attributed it to the green weekends, as she called them. Every other Friday, she would load up her car and make the drive. The drive itself became a decompression chamber. As the miles ticked by, she would shed the layers of city stress. By the time she reached the turnoff for the valley, she was Elara of the garden again. The first return visit was magical. The valley was covered in deep snow. The cottage looked like a gingerbread house frosted with white. She had to shovel the path to the door, the physical labor warming her against the biting chill. Inside, the house was cold, freezing actually, but it woke up quickly once he got the fires going. She found Barnaby waiting on the back porch within an hour of her arrival, as if he knew the schedule. He looked thicker, his winter coat fully grown in. He greeted her with a demanding meow and marched inside as soon as she opened the door, claiming his spot by the fire. Winter in the conservatory was a quiet time. The plants were dormant, resting. Elara's job was mostly maintenance, checking the temperature, ensuring the heater didn't fail, watering sparingly. It was a time of stillness. She would sit in her coat and gloves in the glass house, listening to the snow slide off the roof with a soft, rushing sound. It was during these quiet weekends that she began to write. Not a journal, but stories. She wrote about the history of the house as she imagined it. She wrote about the plants, giving them personalities. She wrote about the way the light changed from hour to hour. Spring arrived with a violence of color. One weekend, the world was brown and gray. The next, the ground was bursting with crocuses, purple, yellow, and white, pushing up through the melting snow. The drive up the valley became a showcase of rebirth. The trees hazed with green as buds swelled. The air lost its bite and smelled of wet mud and growth. The conservatory exploded with life. The ferns unfurled their fiddleheads, prehistoric and strange. The jasmine vine she had pruned back so heavily shot out vigorous new tendrils, covering the ironwork in weeks. Elara spent her weekends with dirt under her fingernails, exhausted and happy. She planted the seeds she had ordered. She created a vegetable patch outside the conservatory, planting rows of lettuce, radishes, and peas. She met the neighbors. A farmer down the road who delivered firewood brought her fresh eggs. A woman who lived in a cottage 3 miles away stopped by to introduce herself, bringing a jar of rhubarb jam. They stood by the gate and talked about the weather and the soil. It was simple, undemanding social contact. No networking, no posturing. Just neighbors. Summer brought the heat. The valley became a bowl of green and gold. The air buzzed with insects. The evenings were long, the sun not setting until after 9. Elara would sit on the back step, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass, drinking iced tea with mint from her garden. The library cataloging was long finished, but she still spent time in the room, reading the books she had listed. She felt like a custodian of knowledge, a guardian of the house's soul. One particularly hot weekend in July, she decided to tackle the pond. It was located at the bottom of the garden, a stone-lined circle that had become a mud pit. It was grueling work. She hauled out buckets of sludge, fighting off mosquitoes. She scrubbed the stones. She refilled it with the hose, watching the water clarify. She bought water lilies from a nursery in the village and placed them carefully. That evening, tired and aching, she sat by the pond. The water reflected the sky, turning from blue to pink to violet. A frog jumped in with a splash, rippling the reflection. It was a small victory, reclaiming this little piece of beauty. As the years cycled back toward autumn, Elara reflected on the anniversary of her arrival. It had been a year since she first drove up that gravel road, burned out and hollow. Now, she felt solid. She had 2 lives, and they balanced each other. The city gave her energy, intellectual challenge, and culture. The cottage gave her roots, silence, and connection to the earth. She didn't have to choose. On the weekend of the full moon in October, she waited in the conservatory again. The queen of the night had grown significantly. There were 3 buds this time. She invited the neighbor, the woman who made the jam, to watch. They sat in the wicker chairs, drinking wine, whispering so as not to disturb the plants. Barnaby was there, of course. When the flowers opened, filling the air with a familiar, incredible scent, Elara felt a tear roll down her cheek. It wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the house that had welcomed her, the garden that had healed her, and the resilience of nature that had shown her how to bloom again. She realized that relaxation wasn't about doing nothing. It was about doing the right things. It was about the rhythm of care, the patience of growth, and the acceptance of seasons. The flowers would fade by morning. The winter would come again. The ivy would try to grow back. And that was okay. She would be there to tend to it, one weekend at a time. The story of Elara and the conservatory wasn't a high drama. There were no dragons, no sudden fortunes, no great romances. It was a story of small, quiet things. The turning of a leaf, the clearing of a window, the perfect cup of tea, the purr of a cat. And in those small things, she found a universe of peace. As the moon began to set, she walked her neighbor to the gate. "Same time next year?" the woman asked. "Same time next year," Elara promised. She walked back to the house, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. The sound of home. She turned off the porch light, plunging the garden into darkness, knowing that even in the dark, the life she had nurtured was growing, breathing, and waiting for her return. And that was enough.